This is Groundeffected. My name is Brent, and welcome to the levelest bed you've ever leveled in your life. And on this channel, I teach you how I 3D print and paint the way that I do. In this video, I'm going to show you how I painted MJ, which was sculpted by CBS Labs. Unfortunately, this file is no longer available to purchase, and that is because the original sculptor got screwed over way too many times by people selling his files on the internet for much cheaper than what he was. And of course, this is not a good thing for artists, and this is one of the reasons why this particular sculptor has decided to remove his files from the internet so that he knows no longer are his files being stolen. I have painted one of these in the past previously. I never got to record that because I painted it before I started making YouTube videos. And when somebody reached out and asked me if I could paint one of them for them, I had to contact the artist himself to make sure that he would be okay with me doing this. And of course, I bought the files again just so that I made sure I paid my fair share towards the original sculptor of this file. That's enough of all that nonsense talk. Let's just get straight into painting MJ from CBS Labs. Turn around, MJ. MJ from CBS Labs. As with all my models, I always start off with a black primer base layer, and that's because I only have a black primer, so I'll start off with black. Also, it is really good because if you use black and you don't happen to get into a really deep dark crevice somewhere, black being in that place is better than a grey or a white or something, because that will definitely stand out a lot more than if it was just black. So for this specific piece, I'm going to start out by painting all the skin tones. I usually start off with my skin tones as this is something that I like to get out the way. As soon as it's done, I can pretty much cover it up and work on all the rest of the details without worrying about having to come back and try and shade in loads of shading with an airbrush on top of all the extra work that I've done. So I like to start out with skin tones. While my base layers of skin tones is drying, I'm going to start out by painting some of the other bits, and as they like to call them, tchotchkes around the base that sits on this base. And I'm going to start off with the little plush Spiderman doll, and I'm going to paint him just a solid red, and I'm going to use incremental highlights with a lighter red over the top, and I'm going to work my way up to an orange highlight on this doll. Once I've got that all painted in, I'm going to let that dry. And while I let that dry, I'm going to go back to painting some more layers onto the skin tones. I start out by just sort of adding an effect of where the light would be kind of hitting. So I'm kind of just placing the highlights at this point as if I was the light source myself. So I choose the light source to come from the top and from the front of the model. This is just the most pleasing for the general average model. If you were trying to do something a little bit more drastic, you may want that light to come from far right or far left of the model. This is just going to create a little bit more of a dramatic effect on the model itself. After I've laid these layers down and while it's drying, I'm going to go back and I'm going to paint the rest of the stuff that I needed to paint on the little plush Spider-Man doll. This is going to be the blue of the rest of his suit, and I'm going to carefully paint this into all the areas that need to be blue. I'm literally just going to paint a solid flat coat over all of these. There doesn't need to be any highlight for this. Because I've highlighted the red, this is going to almost trick your mind into thinking that the entire piece has been highlighted and shadowed, when technically all I've done is highlighted and shadowed just the reds. And yes, this is a bit cheaty, but it definitely works and it is a way of doing this thing. I'm then going to go in and I'm going to start doing all the trimming, which is the black on some of the lines and on the symbol and things like that. I'm also going to paint the whites of his eyes, and I'm slowly going to work my way into making the rest of these details come to life. I pay careful attention to the trims to make sure that they're extra neat, because this is one of the things that's going to make your paint job look so much better. If you make sure that the trimmings are super neat and tidy, your paint's going to look so much better. I also give this a matte clear coat just so that it doesn't look too shiny on the base. Going back to the skins, I've kind of mixed up the way that I do skins, only because I've tested new sets in the last couple of videos, and I've also found things that I seem to like a little bit more, but I'm also not 100% set in the way that I want to do skin tones. So I'm going to kind of jump between two sets for this specific model. Hopefully that doesn't confuse anyone too much, but I am jumping between sets in this model. I really like this pinkish kind of skin color that comes from the Fantasy and Games set from scale 75. I don't particularly like how it airbrushes, but I do really like the color that it gives off. It's a super saturated color and it doesn't dull down or desaturate. It's almost a halfway step for me for the grimoire purple that I usually use. And then for the yellows on the skin tone, I usually water down a yellow, but I decided to try out this Cassandra yellow shade from Citadel. It seemed to work out alright for me. And once that had dried, of course I'm going to layer on a layer of super thin grimoire purple. This is my secret sauce. Don't tell anybody I told you this, but that is the sauce that I use to create a little bit more life in the skin tones. After that's all done, I'm going to come back in and dial some of it down a bit, because I do find I tend to go a little bit too dark with the colors, and I do find that I need to go back and dial it down a little bit and add a bit more highlights. But it's easier for me to add highlights than it is to add shadows. For the bag on the base, I'm going to just spray that with grimoire purple, imagine that. But this time, I'm actually going to use a proper layer of grimoire purple. And in order to glue this piece together, I'm going to do it on the base just to make sure that it's held straight. Otherwise, if I glued this off the base, you might find that the strap doesn't sit very comfortably. So I glue it while it's on the base to make sure it all fits together once it's put together at the end. I sprayed a little bit of Magos purple from the bottom of it just to try and create a little bit more depth. I just wanted to create some shadows on the bag, so it wasn't just one flat color. Obviously I'm going to add a highlight to this later, but you can see that that gives it quite a nice depth by adding a bit of shade to the bottom of the bag. Working on the little gem in the front, I'm going to paint a grey base coat, and I'm going to start building up to a lighter grey to try and get a little bit of a highlight in the center of that gem. For the camera, which is another one of the tchotchkes that sit on the base of this thing, I'm going to paint it solid black obviously, and I'm going to airbrush a grey over the top of that. While that dries, I'm going to come back to the gem and I'm going to add the highlight to make it a little bit brighter. And of course, I happened to spray alcohol onto my piece, which was silly, but luckily it was just alcohol, so it dried really quickly and didn't cause any problems. Then to paint the gem, I'm going to use this technical paint. It's really great. If you need to make a green gemstone, I highly suggest just buying this paint. It will probably last you for a lifetime, but it's incredible for green gemstones. I also then dry brush a little bit of bright pink over the top of the bag, and that ends the bag for me. To create a little bit more depth into the camera, I'm going to use Nuln oil, and I'm going to just spray that from the bottom. Once that had dried, I came in and I used a little bit of white mixed into the grey so that I had like a lightish grey, and I just caught some of the raised edges specifically facing the top of the camera where the lights would hit it. I also did the little lettering, and then I started to work on the lens of the camera. For the lens, I just used greys and I slowly built up kind of a reflection inside of the lens so that it looked like it had a reflection. And of course, because I'm building it up in layers, it's going to take time for that to dry, and while it's drying, I'm also going to work on some of the little greeblies around the outside of the camera. Once I'd built up a decent looking reflection with just the greys and whites, I'm now going to start to tint that. And the reason I want to tint it is because a lens isn't just black. It has colors. It usually reflects whatever color its environment is, things like that. So in order to do that, I need to make sure I have a good solid base where the whites are nice and bright and the blacks are nice and dark. This is going to help create a good base layer for me to layer glazes over the top of that and get a good highlight and make it look like the colors are blending into each other. For those colors, I'm going to use an ink. I didn't manage to grab a screenshot, but for the purple that I used, I essentially just used grimoire purple, and I added a little bit of pink to it at the end. I also used the blue very thin, made sure it was super dry. Once it had dried, I came back in and started to build up on the highlights again, this time with just pure whites, very thin, but I did build them up quite high in a highlight so that they did look really reflective and bright. Once that had all been done and I was satisfied with how it looked, I painted a clear gloss coat over the top. I then masked out certain areas on the base. I didn't have to do this perfectly. The only reason I did this is because painting white is a bit of a difficult one. So I painted the eyes white first and just roughly masked them so that they were protected while I painted the black on the base. And yes, this is one of those models where I'm going to chop and change between pieces like I have no sense or reason for what I'm doing. But trust me, I'm just working on things as they dry. I'm working on other things. Working on the base, I used just a plain red and I slowly built this up. Red is not one of those colors that covers essentially very easily. At least the reds that I have don't, so I usually have to do 2 or 3 layers of this, which is kind of bad, but it's also good because I can use that to my advantage by building up. If I wanted a brighter color in the front, I can just leave say 2 layers at the back and build up 3 or 4 layers in the front, and the red would get brighter and brighter the more layers that I add on top of each other. And while the base dries, I'm going to go back in and paint the rest of the boots. There's a little buckle that needed some paint on it, and then I'm going to start to work on the hair. For the hair, I just base coated the entire thing with Flesh Terror's red, and the reason I use this is because the red is quite potent at this. It also fills into gaps and goes a little bit darker, so it does give me a nice range of reds throughout the base layers. I also used that same red for her fingernails, which is pretty cheesy, but it's the way I painted them. For the jeans, I'm just going to use a deep blue and I'm going to paint that over the black. I'm going to make sure I leave a lot of the black though. So this blue needs to come from the highlights, mostly from the top, and any areas of wear, especially around the thighs, the sides of the butt and things like that, they need to be a little bit bluer, and black can stay in the shadows. I used a bit of a blue tone to shade it from the bottom so that the shadows weren't completely black, they did have a blue tinge to them. I then came in with the dry brush and I dry brushed a little bit of white mixed into those blues, and I progressively lightened that highlight color. I'm working my way up towards not pure white, but definitely has a lot of blue in it still. It's just a lot lighter than the blue that I had originally put down. I make sure to dry brush that in areas, again, where the wear and tear would be. Jeans have very visual wear in them, and especially these type of jeans, they are ripped jeans, and as you can see, I'm painting the skin poking through it. So with ripped jeans, you want them to have a look to them that they have got a lot of wear on them. Once I'd done all these things and the jeans had started to dry, I started to work on the webbing that is on the side of the jeans. There is quite a bit of detail on these jeans. It's not too complicated, but is something that definitely adds to the piece. You probably could get away with something like this by just dropping a wash over the areas, specifically this section where there's a spider and the roses. You could probably just put a wash into that and get away with it just being perhaps an embroidered patch or something, but I wanted to make it look like it was a little bit more colorful, so I added in a full black for the spider emblem, and then I painted the roses red and the leaves green. All the while I'm waiting for layers to dry and I don't want to put my hands over that wet paint, you'll notice I work back and forth. So I may go back to the skins while I'm waiting for the reds to dry. I may go back to some patches of the jeans while I'm waiting for the greens to dry, things like that. I do try and work as efficiently as I possibly can. In total, this entire model took me around 12.5 hours to finish. That's only the painting time. That doesn't count any of the sanding or preparation that I did beforehand, because that I didn't record, so I don't really have the time for that, to be honest. Once the green had dried, I then went into the roses and added a little bit more brighter reds onto some of the edges, just so that there is a gradient inside of them and they're not just flat red, because that's not as interesting to look at. And of course, I went back in and added some more highlights onto the parts of the skin sticking through the ripped jeans. And then I kind of cheated a little bit for this. I mean, really, I'm just trying to be efficient, so it could be easier for you if you wanted to try it this way. Some people consider it cheating. I don't really care as long as it looks good at the end. But I used a marker pen to do the line work on the embroidery patch that's on her jeans. It's just a little bit cleaner and a lot quicker for me. I found painting that out would have taken me a little bit longer, and I was trying to be efficient with this model. I then worked onto the t-shirt, and that was pretty straightforward. It's just a solid flat grey base layer, and once that is down, I used a little bit of blue mixed into that same grey that I mixed for the base, and I dry brushed that onto the highlights and the high spots on the model. I then needed to work on the symbol, and for the symbol I used the same technique that I used for the roses. Basically, I essentially just base coated it with red, and because it was over a dark color, it's going to take a couple of layers to make this a good solid red. And while the red layers were drying in between, I worked on things like the teeth and tidying up edges around the hair and stuff like that. I added white to the eyes. I had to do that in a couple of layers, of course, because white is not the kind of color you want to slap on too thick because it will look chalky and terrible. Once that was done, the lines inside this are a lot thicker, so I felt like it'd be a lot easier for me to actually paint these in, and of course I did paint these in with a brush. Once I had painted them, I did the edging around the vices of the mask, and I called the t-shirt done. For the hair, I just dry brushed a series of reds up to orange, up to yellow, and that was just basically a super simple dry brush over most of the hair. For her eyebrows, I mixed the same base tone for her hair, and I added a little bit of brown to that so that they were a little bit darker. You never want the hair and the eyebrows to be the same color. Eyebrows are usually darker than the hair. And for the eyes, I feel like this is nothing new. I start off with a black base. This just allows me to shape the eyes a lot better, and I can come back in and shape it with the whites later. I added a little bit of red around her lips to give her a nice shiny red lipstick, and I tidied up the rest of her teeth. I then shaped the eyes as best as I could. I went in with a slightly off white, and I paint them solid white at first, and then I come into the recesses in the corners specifically, and I paint that with a bluish grey. Once I've painted that and allowed it to dry, I need to tidy it up. Once it's been tidied up and the whites are white again, I then start working on the iris. And for the iris, I use the color of the eye mixed with a little bit of black, just so that it's really dark for the first layer down. Once I've got that first layer down, which is essentially the shape of it, I'm going to start working up all the way to the brightest blue for these eyes, specifically because they're blue eyes. Once I've done that and they're as bright blue as they possibly can be, I add a black little pupil in the center of each one, and I take a little bit of white and I add a highlight on the right hand side, a large highlight, and then a tiny little one right next to that. And once that's completely fully dried, I then tried to use something a little bit different. Normally I would use an Army Painter clear glass, but this time I decided to use the Tamiya clear glass. It's called X22 or something like that, and I just painted that over all the shiny areas like the eyes, the teeth, and the lips. And that's when I called it done. Thank you so much for watching another one of my videos and making it all the way to the end of the video. Make sure to click like and subscribe if you would like to see more of this content in the future. And of course, while you're down there, you might as well leave some words in the little square box that YouTube gives you to leave some words. Also, that is the only place you can leave words, so you might as well leave some words there. And now, we're also at the time of the video where I need to thank the patrons for keeping these lights blinding my eyeballs. And while we're away this week, we got a couple new patrons who I'd like to thank right now. Jazdeep Jagdev, Fallen Angel, and Brian Zander. Thank you, my dudes, so much for keeping these eyes blinded by the lights that are blinding them. Of course, if you would like to support the channel and you're not interested in joining the Patreon, you can easily just click subscribe, because that way I will have one more new subscriber. And this indeed helps to facilitate the total internet takeover of Groundeffected. If you are on part of the Patreon, you will be given access to the Discord, and in that Discord we run an Artist of the Month. And this month, the winner of Artist of the Month is Full Vid with the rogue that he painted. I'm pretty sure this was sculpted by Nacho CG. If you look at everything else that everybody else painted this month, there is some incredibly great entries, and of course there always is incredibly great entries, and this is something that I really enjoy holding every month. If you are one of the Patreons and in the Discord, make sure to use this channel and post your best work once a month, and I will choose one of the best ones to feature on the channel every month. And now that we are completely at the end of a video, I would like to say to you, if you didn't like anything you saw in this video, it's pretty simple process hereafter. All you have to do is click the dislike button and then f off. I guess that's the end of recording that. That was pretty simple, really.